Here Be Dragons by Sharon Penman. Chapter 2. June 1187. Shropshire, England. Think you then that there be war? Hugh Corbet hesitated. It was no easy thing to be a younger brother in an age in which all passed by law to a man's eldest son. But Hugh had been luckier than most. His was a family of considerable wealth. The Corbets held lands not only in Shropshire, but in Normandy, Warwickshire, and Worcestershire, and Wales. Robert Corbet had inherited the barony of Cowes, but there were manors to spare for Hugh, and his relationship with his brother was blessedly free of the poisonous jealousy that bred such strife between a fortunate firstborn and his landless siblings. Much of the time they were in harmony, working in tandem for the common good of the Corbets. But in this they were at odds. In this they were a house divided, much like the rival royal masters they served. For Robert's loyalties lay with Richard, King Henry's eldest son and heir, and Hugh's sympathies went out to the beleaguered, aging king. Hugh was silent, considering Robert's grim query. "I would hope to God it will not come to that, Rob," he said at last. "Father against son, that is the ugliest of all feuds, goes against the natural order of things." Robert took this as a veiled jab at Richard, the unfilial son. It would never have come to this if Henry would but formally recognise Richard as his heir. Hugh had to concede the truth of that. Finding himself forced to defend the indefensible, he at once took to the offensive, saying sharply, "Be that as it may, Richard had no right to ally himself with the King of France, not against his own sire. You know damned well why he felt that need, Hugh. With their brother Geoffrey dead in France last summer, that leaves but Richard and John in line for the succession, and Richard knows all too well that his father loves him not. He knows too that Henry has ever favoured John. What else can Richard think except that his father means to raise John up to the place that is rightfully his?" "And a right fine fear that be," Hugh scoffed. "One to cover a multitude of sins. You know fully well as I that Henry could anoint John as the very king of heaven for all it would avail him. The lords of this realm would never countenance so flagrant a breach of the laws of inheritance, nor can you doubt the outcome. Whatever John might be given, he'd not long hold, not against Richard. No, Rob, if that be the balm Richard uses to soothe his conscience, he is a man in need of absolution." Robert's face was mottled, splotched with resentful red. "Richard is to be our next king, should God so will it, and I'll not have you speak ill of him in my hearing." Hugh sighed. By now he could recite the dialogue verbatim for these acrimonious exchanges. Rob was as blind as a barn owl in noon-bright sun, dazzled by Richard's celebrated skill with the sword. Mayhap it was true that he was the finest soldier in Christendom, but if he had in him the makings of a good king, Hugh had yet to see any signs of it. Like as not, he'd pawn London itself to raise the gold needed for his foreign wars. And John? Would John be any better? Hugh thought not. He came abruptly to his feet. Why offend Rob and unsettle himself? To what end? Let it lie. They were sequestered in the uppermost chamber of the castle keep, alone but for a bored page and a dozing mastiff, Robert's faithful shadow. The window was unshuttered. In winter it would be screened with oiled and thin scraped hide. But this was summer, and it was open to sun and sound from the tilt-yard below. Hugh went to it and watched it for a while. "What do you watch?" The question was polite in tone, conciliatory in intent. Robert thrived on family discord no more than Hugh. Llewelyn and some of his friends, as Robert joined him. Hugh gestured towards a small group of youngsters gathered below. Llewelyn was mounted on a burnished chestnut gelding. As the boys watched, he lowered his lance, took aim, and sent the gelding cantering across the tilt-yard. He hit the target off centre, and the quintain swung about in a wide arc, the sandbag slicing through the air like an opponent's counter-blow. It should have sent him tumbling from the saddle to the straw meant to soften youthful falls, but Llewelyn twisted sideways in the saddle, leaned so far to his left that it seemed inevitable he'd be unhorsed, and the sandbag swept by harmlessly overhead. Hugh grinned. It was a showy stunt, an undeniably impressive feat of horsemanship, one Hugh had seen before. Robert had not, however, and he swore in startled wonder. How in Christ did he do that without breaking his neck? Hugh laughed. You'd not credit what I've seen that lad do on a horse. I truly believe the Welsh do learn to ride, even ere they're weaned. Below them, Stephen de Hodnay was taking his turn upon Llewellyn's gelding. He too hit the quintain awry, and, seconds later, went sprawling into the straw, with a bruising impact that earned him no sympathy from the two watching men. They had suffered too many such spills themselves during their own years as knightly apprentices. Reclaiming Saul, Llewelyn led it over to the fence, held out the reins to his brother. Adda shook his head, but Llewelyn persisted, manoeuvring the gelding up to the fence so the younger boy could mount. Once securely in the saddle, Adda shared much of his awkwardness, and, while he did not attempt to quintain, he put the gelding through several intricate manoeuvres, showed himself to be a better rider than most of Llewellyn's friends. Robert frowned. No matter how often he told himself it was not unchristian to feel such abhorrence of deformity, he could not control his distaste. He could not keep his eyes from Adda's twisted leg. Thank the Lord Jesus that his own Tom was sound of limb, that the younger boys too were whole. He lacks for spirit, that one. If not for Llewellyn's coaxing, I dare say he'd never stir from the hearth. Well, it's hard on the lad, Rob. Being lame, what future has he after all? Under Welsh law, that crooked leg bars him from any claim to his father's lands. Robert shrugged. He's not likely to starve. Their law also holds that he must be provided for. True, but would you want to be taken care of, like a woman, at 13? Adda's old enough to feel the shame of it. I suppose, Robert agreed, without interest. It was not that he wished Adda ill, merely that he regretted his grafting onto the Corbet family tree. It was fortunate indeed that Llewelyn was more promising stock. Tell me, Hugh, what plans have you made for Llewellyn's future? Well, it is the custom in Wales for boys to be placed with a local lord when they reach 14 or so. Whilst in his service, they learn the use of arms, tactics, and warfare, much like our youths do while serving as squires. Margaret thought to send Llewelyn back to her brothers for such training, but I think I've persuaded her that we should place him as a squire in a Norman household. I dare say the boy will bark at first, but I feel such a move would be in his best interest. That is just what I'd hoped you'd say, Hugh. You see, when I was in London at Whitsuntide, I had the good fortune to encounter His Grace, the Earl of Chester. Naturally, the conversation turned to our common interests, protecting our respective lands from Welsh raids. He was most interested to learn that your stepson is the grandson of Owain Farr, and he suggested that he find a place for the boy in his household. Jesu. This was so far above Hugh's expectations that he was, for the moment, speechless, and Robert grinned, well pleased with himself. I see I need not tell you what an opportunity this will be for the boy, for us all. Chester is one of the greatest lords of the realm, and as shrewd as a fox for all his youth. He saw at once the advantage of befriending a boy who might one day rule as his grandfather's stead. Llewelyn has the blood right, after all, and most assuredly the spirit. With luck. He shrugged again and said, But a chance like this, to come to manhood in an earl's house. Loyalties given in youth often last for life. As Chester's squire, the brilliance of Llewelyn's world cannot help but eclipse all he's learned in the woodlands of Wales. He'll find himself among the greatest Norman lords, and the royal court, and in time he'll come to embrace Norman values, to adopt Norman traditions as his own. Robert paused. Do not misunderestimate me, Hugh. I know how fond you are of the boy, and I find him a likeable lad myself. But I cannot help feeling a certain disappointment that, after 4 years, he clings so tenaciously to the teachings of an undeniably primitive people. Despite all the advantages you've given him, Llewelyn remains so stubbornly Welsh, Hugh suggested dryly, and Robert laughed. He'd actually been about to say untamed, before thinking better of it. And he did not demur now at his brother's interpretation. They were, he thought, merely different ways of saying the same thing. Well, I shall talk to Margaret this forenoon. Tell her about Chester's offer, Hugh began, and then turned towards the opening door. Ah, Margaret, we were just speaking of you. Rob has... Margaret? Upon seeing Mariette for the first time, Hugh had blessed his luck, suddenly found himself eager to consummate their political alliance in the marriage bed. Mariette was a beautiful woman, if rather exotic by English standards, and after 4 years of marriage he still took considerable pleasure in the sight of her. But she had no smile for him right now, and the golden glow that owed so little to the sun was gone. Bleached of colour, her face was ashen, and her lashes were sooty thickets, smudged with the coal bleeding into a wet trail of tears. She paid no heed to Robert, cross to her husband. Hugh, we must go home. We must go back to Powys at once. It is my brother, Owain. He's been murdered. There was a word in Welsh, hiraeth, that translated as longing, but it meant much more. Spoke of the Welsh love for the land, of the yearning for the exile for family, friends, and home. Whenever he was claimed by Hiraeth, Llewelyn would flee to the heights of Breathin Craig, and there he would spend hours in sun-drenched solitude, gazing out over the vales of the rivers Hafren, Funry, and Tannet. Now he was back at last, sitting on Sull before the grey stones and slate roofs of Llanfair, the church of St. Mary. This ancient church in the Vale of Maevod was the traditional burial place for the princes of Powys. Here his mother's father had been entombed, and here his slain uncle would be laid to rest. He sought to summon up grief for his uncle. He could little remember, but to no avail. He'd come back for a funeral to mourn a man who was his blood king, and yet, as he looked upon the wooded hills that rose behind the church, he felt only exhilaration. Felt like a caged gerfalcon, suddenly free to soar up into the sun-bright azure sky. Here he'd passed the first 10 years of his life. 7 miles to the south was Castell Coch, the ancestral seat for the princes of Powys. His mother's family had a palace, less than a mile away at Marthrevel. The woods of mountain ash and oak and sycamore, the river teeming with trout and grayling, dappled by summer sun and shadowed by willow and alder. Each stone was known to him, each hawthorn hedge rooted in deep memory. He was home. He glanced sideways at his companion, one of the stepfather's squires. Should he tell Alan of his family's place? He knew what the other boy would expect. A Norman edifice of soaring stone and mortar. For while most castles were timbered fortresses, the word palace conjured up images of grandeur and luxury. Llewelyn had been to London, had seen the tower and the palace at Westminster, and he'd heard of the splendours of Windsor Castle. He knew there was nothing in Wales to compare to the magnificence of the Norman court, and he cared not at all that this was so. He laughed suddenly, and when Alan shot him a curious look, he slid from Sull, handed the squire the reins. "I'd be obliged if you'd look after Sull, Alan. Should my lady mother or stepfather ask for me, concoct what excuse you will." Alan grinned. "Consider it done, but are you sure you do not want company?" Llewelyn was tempted, but only briefly. He thought of Alan as a friend, but his were memories, emotions, sensations that no Norman could hope to understand. The fernery was free of the mud and debris that so often polluted English rivers, for there were no towns to despoil its purity with refuse and human waste. Llewelyn could see chalk-white pebbles glimmering in the shallow river bottom, see the shadows cast by fish feeding midst the wavering stalks of water weeds. He forgot entirely that his uncle had died by this very river, his place at Craighova besieged by a man who was Llewelyn's own first cousin, Gwynwynwyn. Prince of southern Powys, he forgot his mother's tears, forgot his stepfather's ambitious plans for the future, forgot all but the here and now. He'd walked these woods so often in memory, hearing the rustle of wood mice, the squirrels, the warning cries of overhead birds, sentinels over the alert for the intrusion of a man into their domain. A fox came to the river to drink, was slow to heed the alert and froze at sight of Llewelyn. Muzzle silvered with crystal droplets of river water, black eyes bright as polished jet. Boy and fox stared at one another in rapt silence, and then Llewelyn snapped his fingers, freeing the fox to vanish into the shadows as if by sorcery. Not a twig cracked, not a leaf rustled to mark its passing. Llewelyn laughed and walked on. He felt no surprise when he broke through a clearing in the wood and came upon the boys by the river. Somehow he'd known that he would find them here. The Fernwy had always been their favourite fishing stream. Shyness was an alien emotion to Llewelyn, but he found himself suddenly ensnared by it now, reluctant to approach the youths who'd once been like his brothers. Theirs was the companionable silence born of the intimacy of blood and bonding that had begun in the cradle. Watching them, Llewelyn felt an unexpected emotion stir, one closely akin to envy. He belonged here, too, fishing on the banks of the Fernwy with Ednevydd and Rhys, but how to surmount the barriers built up by 4 years of English exile? They were lounging on the grass in positions as characteristic as they were familiar. Rhys sitting upright, utterly intent upon the trout he'd behooked. Ednevydd sprawled on his back in the sun, fishing pole wedged into a pyramid pile of rocks. And, as ever, Llewelyn found himself marvelling that the two boys, so unlike, could share the same blood. First cousins they were, but none seeing them together would ever have guessed that kinship. Rhys shared with Llewelyn the pitch-black hair so common to their people, but while Llewelyn's eyes were dark, too, Rhys had the eyes of a Welsh mountain cat, purest, palest green, his unusual colouring, thick sable lashes, and features so symmetrical as to draw all eyes were, for him, a burden rather than a blessing. He loathed being fussed over, and yet his startling beauty of face doomed him to be forever fending off the gushing compliments and effusive embraces of his doting female relatives, who considered him quite the handsomest male child ever born, and took great pride in showing him off to mothers and aunts of less favoured youngsters, to Rhys's utter disgust and the vast amusement of his friends. It was possible to look upon his beauty, for there was no other word for it, and to note his slightness of build, and conclude that there was a softness, a fragility about the boy. That was, Llewelyn had long ago learned, an impression so erroneous as to be utterly ludicrous, and not a little dangerous. Rhys was hard, and unyielding as the flint of his native land. There was no give in him, none at all. As for Ednevydd, in all honesty he could only be described as homely. Lanky brown hair, deep-set eyes of a nondescript colour, that was neither brown nor hazel, but a murky shade somewhere in between. A mouth too wide, and a chin too thrusting, too prominent. Big-boned even as a small boy, he seemed to have spouted at least a foot since Llewelyn had seen him last, and Llewelyn had no doubts that when fully grown, Ednevydd would tower over head and shoulders above the other men. As he watched, Llewelyn suddenly found himself remembering a childhood game he'd long ago liked to play with his mother, in which they sought to identify people with their animal counterparts. Llewelyn had promptly pleased his sleekly independent and unpredictable mother by categorizing her as a cat. Hugh, whom he liked, he saw as an Irish wolfhound, a dog as bright as it could even be tempered. Robert Corbet, whom he did not like, he dubbed another sort of dog altogether, the courageous but muddle-headed mastiff. Morgan, too, was easily to classify. For Morgan was a priest with the soul of a soldier, a man who'd chosen of his free will to fetter his wilder instincts to the stringent disciplines of his church. Morgan, Llewelyn had explained to Mariad, could only be a falcon, for the falcon was the most predatory of birds, a prince of the skies that could none the less be tamed to hunt at a man's command. Other too was a bird, a caged sparrowhawk, tethered to earth whilst his spirit pined only to fly. When he told his mother that, tears had filled her eyes, but when she wanted to know how he saw himself, Llewelyn grew reticent, evasive. From the day she'd taken him to the Tower of London to see the caged cats, he'd known what animal he wanted to claim as his own, the tawny-maned lion, but that was a vanity he was not willing to confess even to his mother. He had never tried to characterize Rhys or Ednevydd, but it came to him now, without need for reflection, for Rhys had the unpredictable edginess of a high-strung stallion, and Ednevydd all the latent power, the massive strength and lazy good humour of the tame bear he'd once seen at London's Smithfield Fair. Ednevydd yawned and stretched, reaching for the woven sack that lay beside the bait pail. He shook several apples onto the grass, tossed one to Rhys. "I dare say you want one too, Llewelyn?" he queried nonchalantly, and without looking up, sent an apple sailing through the air. It was remarkably accurate for a blind pitch, landed just where Llewelyn had been standing seconds before. He was no longer there, however, having recoiled with such vehemence that he bumped bruisingly into the nearest tree. Rhys, no less startled, spun around so precipitately that he overturned the bait pail, and, as he cursed and Llewelyn took several deep breaths, trying to get his pulse rate back to normal, Ednevydd rolled in the grass and laughed and laughed. "How in hellfire did I know I was there?" Llewelyn demanded, and Ednevydd feigned surprise. "How could I not? With you making enough noise to bestir the dead? Is that the English style of woodland warfare?" He'd always been a lethal tease, and Llewelyn was not normally thin-skinned, but they'd not yet established the boundaries of their new relationship. Llewelyn opened his mouth to make a sharp retort, but Rhys was quicker. Rhys's pride was prickly and unpredictable, easily affronted, and he'd been embarrassed by his failure to take notice of Llewelyn. Glaring at his cousin, he snapped, "And Llewelyn might well ask if this is the Welsh way of welcome." Turning back to Llewelyn, he smiled, said, "We thought you'd be home for your uncle's funeral. We were watching for you." Llewelyn smiled back, and coming forward, he settled himself beside them on the grass. A silence fell between them, one that seemed likely to swallow up any words they could throw into the void. It was broken at last by Llewelyn. He heard himself making courteous queries about the health and well-being of their families, falling back upon all the obligatory conversational gambits to be shared between strangers. Nor did Rhys ease the awkwardness any by offering Llewelyn formal condolences for the death of his uncle. Llewelyn would have liked to speak freely, to explain that he'd not known his Uncle Owain all that well, but he felt constrained to respond with a conventional politeness, and thus found himself flying false colours, coming before them in the guise of grief that was not his. Rhys offered him an apple. "Did your stepfather come with you?" he asked, as if he could possibly have any interest in Hugh's whereabouts. Llewelyn nodded. "Hugh came on behalf of the Corbet family, as a gesture of respect to my mother's kin." He stopped, for Ednevydd had leaned forward, was regarding him with exaggerated attention. "Why do you look at me like that? Has my face of a sudden turned green?" "I was trying to decide," Ednevydd drawled, "whether or not you'd picked up a French accent." Llewelyn tensed, but he looked more closely at the other boy, saw that Ednevydd's eyes were bright and friendly with laughter. "No French accent," he said, and grinned. "But I did spend some right uncomfortable days in the spring worrying that I'd picked up the French pox." Ednevydd's mouth twitched. "Llewelyn," with a frown towards his cousin. "If you please, no bawdy talk, not before the lad here." Ducking just in time as an apple whizzed past his head. Seconds later, Rhys followed up his aerial assault with a direct frontal attack and Ednevydd, caught off balance, was knocked flat. Rhys's anger was more assumed than not, and their scuffling soon took on an almost ritualistic quality, for this was an old game, rarely played out in earnest, and likely to continue until one or the other of the combatants lost interest. In this case, the mock battle lasted until they noticed that Llewelyn had appropriated the rest of the apples and stretched himself out comfortably in the turf to watch, for all the world like a front-row spectator at a bear-baiting. "Go for it, lads," he said wryly, and, by common consent, they both pounced on him for once. For a few hectic moments all three boys were tumbling about on the river-bank, until at last they lay panting in a tangled heap, lacking breath for anything but laughter. After that, there seemed to be too much to say and not enough time in which to say it, and they plunged into the past as if fearing it might somehow be forgotten, if it were not shared immediately, interrupting each other freely, trading insults and memories, laughing for laughter's sake alone. Rhys had gone to the river to drink. Returning, he threw himself down in the grass and broke into Ednevydd's monologue to demand, "When must you go back to England, Llewelyn?" "I'm not going back," Llewelyn said, at once capturing their undivided attention. "You both know the history of my house. Know how my uncles, Dafydd and Rhodri, cheated my father and my other uncles out of their rightful share of my grandfather's inheritance. They carved Gwynedd up between them, as if it were a meat pie. Forced my father, Owain Farr's firstborn, into exile. Brought about his death whilst I was still in my cradle. His blood is on their hands, and they've yet to answer for it. I think it's time they did." "You mean to avenge your father's death?" Rhys's green eyes were luminous, a glitter with sudden excitement, but Ednevydd seemed far more dubious. "All I know is the English are born half mad," he said slowly. "But I wonder if the madness might not be in the water they drink, or the air they breathe. How else can you explain that 4 short years among them could have scattered your wits?" Llewelyn was amused. "Your faith in me is truly wondrous to behold, Ednevydd. Think you that I'm such a fool to challenge my uncles on my own, with only God on my side? I had a long talk this morn with my uncle Griffith, and he has sworn to give me his full backing, men who know war well, and the money to pay them. He even offered the services of no less a soldier than Gwyn ap Apnewen. It is my intent, too, to join forces with my uncle Cynnan's 2 grown sons. They were denied their inheritance, just as I was, giving us common cause against Dafydd and Rhodri." "When you put it that way, it does not sound quite so crack-brained," Ednevydd conceded. "But how in the name of Lord Jesus did you ever get your lady mother and stepfather to give you their consent?" Llewelyn hesitated. "Well, to be honest, I have not told them yet," he admitted, and flushed when they both laughed. "Can you truly blame me?" he protested. "We'll be bound to have a god-awful row. I do not know whom my mother will be more wroth with, me or my uncle Griffith, for aiding and abetting me in this. As for Hugh, he's like to have an apoplectic fit. You see, he'd arranged for me to enter the household of a Norman earl." Llewelyn shook his head in mock regret. "Poor Hugh! How he has struggled to make of me a proper Norman. I once overheard his brother grumbling about turning a sow's ear into silk purse, and I dare say Hugh has had moments when he's in heartfelt agreement." This last was said without rancour. Llewelyn never doubted that Hugh's fondness for him was genuine, but he'd come to understand that affection and bias could take root in the same soil. In this, he had the advantage of Rhys and Ednevydd, and they looked so offended when he felt compelled to come to Hugh's defence. "Yet he is a good man for all of that. My mother has been quite content with him, and he grinned suddenly, I never came to forgive him for the greatest sin, that of not being born Welsh." But here they had no common meeting ground. Neither Rhys nor Ednevydd had English friends, English kin. Both looked blank, and then Rhys dismissed what he did not understand, said, "You'll not let them talk you out of it?" "No," Llewelyn sat up, his eyes searching their faces with sudden sober intent. "I shall have men to counsel me, men well lessoned in the ways of war, but no matter how much help I get from my Uncle Griffith or my cousins, I shall have to stand or fall on my own efforts. If I cannot convince people that my claim be just, if I cannot win their allegiance, nor can I expect my blood to count for aught should I fall into David's hands, and the risks will be no less for those men who follow me." He paused. "My Uncle Griffith has agreed to speak with your fathers, should you. You want us to help you overthrow David and Rodri, to fight with you." Rhys could wait no longer, burst out eagerly. "Jesus, Llewelyn, need you even ask?" Llewelyn smiled. "What of you, Ednevydd? Does Rhys speak for you too?" "I'd as soon speak for myself," Ednevydd said, sounding quite serious for once. "I want to be sure I fully understand. We'd be camping out in the mountains of Gwynedd, harassing your uncles, howsoever we could, living like outlaws, sleeping in the open, eating on the run, rebels with prices on our heads. Is that a fair summing up of what we would expect?" "Very fair," Llewelyn agreed, and a slow grin began to spread over Ednevydd's face. "Who could possibly turn down an offer like that?" "It is settled then," Rhys said briskly, never having doubted what his cousin's answer would be. As he spoke, he was rolling up the sleeve of his tunic, before Llewelyn and Ednevydd realised what he meant to do. He unsheathed his dagger, and, without the slightest hesitation, drew it swiftly across the bared skin of his forearm. "This is too important for mere words," he explained composedly, watching the flow of his own blood with indifferent eyes. "For this we must swear in blood." It was a gesture as irresistible as it was melodramatic, at least to Llewelyn. Ednevydd looked rather less enthusiastic, and when Rhys passed him the bloodied dagger, he took it with such reluctance that Llewelyn burst out laughing. "Since you share the same blood as Rhys, mayhap you could swear too, in his," he gibed. And Ednevydd grimaced, drew a few drops of blood. "Here, my lord princeling," he grunted, "your turn." Llewelyn made a far more modest cut than Rhys, saying, "If I'm to spill my blood, I'd as soon spill it in Gwynedd." And rising, he searched the clearing until he'd gathered a handful of rock moss. This he brought back to Rhys. Leaning over, he applied it to the boy's arm. "Hold this upon the cut till the bleeding ceases, or you might well end up in the first casualty of my war," he said and laughed again, realising that he was happy at this moment as he'd never been in his entire life. Hugh Corbet was surprised to find the great hall all but deserted. As in England, the hall was the heart of the Welsh home life. But then he heard the voices, angry, accusing, and he understood. At the far end of the hall, his wife and her elder brother Griffith were standing, and even Hugh, who knew no Welsh other than a few endearments Mahared had taught him in bed, could tell at once that they were quarrelling bitterly. Griffith's retainers and servants had wisely fled the battlefield. Only Llewelyn, Adda, and Morgan ap Blethyn, his wife's chaplain, were still in the hall. As Hugh moved up the centre aisle, Griffiths turned on his heel and stalked out of the door behind the dais, slamming it resoundingly behind him. Hugh was secretly amused that his wife should be giving her brother such grief. He had discovered early on in their marriage that Welsh women were more outspoken and less submissive than their Norman sisters, and, while he'd learned to accept Mahared on her own terms, it pleased him to see Griffith reaping what he had sown. For certes, a society in which women were not taught their proper place was bound to lack harmony, a natural sense of order. But he was taken aback by what happened next. Mahared swung around on her eldest son, put a question to him, and when he shook his head, she slapped him across the face. Hugh was astonished, for he'd never seen her raise her hand at Llewelyn before, not even on occasions when the boy had richly deserved it. He hastened towards them, wondering what sins would loom so large in her eyes. Could Llewelyn have set his heart upon trading his gelding for an untamed stallion? No, Margaret was doting mother, not a foolish one. She'd never sought to wrap the boy in soft wool. What then? Had he got some village lass with child? That was likely enough. He was an attractive lad, and having discovered where his sword was meant to be sheathed, seemed set upon it getting as much practice as possible. But no. Why should Margaret fret over a peasant wench ploughed and cropped? She was too sensible for that. Would not blame Llewelyn for so small a sin. Mahared had turned away abruptly, sitting down suddenly on the steps of the dais. Llewelyn followed at once, hovering uncertainly at her side, his face troubled. But when he patted her shoulder awkwardly, she pushed his hand away. Hugh quickened his step, no longer amused. "Margaret, what's wrong?" "Ask Llewelyn," she said truly, and then, "He says he's not going back to England with us. He wants to stay in Wales, to try and overthrow his uncles in Gwynedd." Her answer was so anticlimactic that Hugh felt laughter well up within him. Dangerously close to the surface, he gave an abrupt, unconvincing cough, knowing she'd never forgive him if he laughed. But how like a woman, to let herself get so distraught over a boy's caprice, a whim of the moment that bore little relationship to reality. Doubtless, too, she'd been seeking to scare Llewelyn with horror stories of hardships he'd been facing. The dangers and deprivations, the hand-to-mouth existence of a rebel on the run, and what could better be calculated to appeal to a foolhardy 14-year-old? "Is it true, Llewelyn?" Llewelyn nodded, but his eyes were wary, and Hugh hesitated, recognizing the need to tread lightly, not wanting to trample the boy's pride into dust. "This is a rather ambitious undertaking, lad." "Too much so. In saying that, I do not mean to belittle your courage in any way, but courage alone is not enough. Not when we are talking of rebellion." "I know," Llewelyn slanted a sudden glance towards Morgan. "Courage without common sense is the least of God's gifts." "It's glad I am to hear you say that, Llewelyn, for you should go up against your uncles now, on your own. I fear the only ground in Gwynedd you'd claim would be enough to fill a grave." "I know," Llewelyn said again. And when Hugh smiled, so did he, before adding, "This is why I did appeal to my Uncle Griffith for advice and assistance. He thinks I'm of an age to lay claim to what is mine, and has promised to help me do just that." Hugh's jaw dropped. "He what?" Jerking around to stare at his wife. "Your brother has agreed to do this? To aid him in his madness?" he demanded incredulously, and she nodded grimly. Christ, no wonder Margaret was so wroth. Of all the damned fool. "I am sorry, Llewelyn," he said curtly, "but you must put this scheme from your mind. There is no way on God's earth that I'd ever give my consent." "I'm sorry too," Llewelyn said softly. "I should have liked to have had your approval." He'd spoken so politely that it was a moment or so before Hugh realised he'd just been defied. "You're not being offered a choice, Llewelyn. I'm telling you that you're to forget this lunacy. You're to return to Shropshire with your mother and me, and that will be the end of it. As for your uncle, I'd not speak ill of a man in his own house, but he had no right to encourage you in this, to go against our wishes. You are not his son, after all." "I'm not your son either." Hugh stiffened. The boy's matter-of-fact reminder hurt more than he'd ever expected, or Llewelyn had intended. It was a hurt that camouflaged itself in rage, and he clenched his fist, his face darkening with a sudden surge of blood. But Llewelyn felt that his mother had a perfect right to hit him if she was chose. He did not accord Hugh the same privilege, and he'd prudently put distance between them. "No, you are not my flesh and blood, but when I wed your mother, your wardship passed into my hands. That means, Llewelyn, that you are answerable to me, and will be until you come of legal age. Once you reach your majority, you may do what you damned well please. May sell your wife as cheaply as you like, but for the next 7 years you'll do what I say. Is that clear?" "Very." It was Llewelyn's composure that stuck the first false note. The boy was too calm, was arguing more like an adult than a youngster, with a head full of fanciful dreams, and Hugh said warningly, "If you think to run away once we're back in Shropshire, Llewelyn." Llewelyn was shaking his head. "I've heard you out, Hugh. Now, I'd have you do as much for me." I'd not have you think of me ungrateful. And I do not deny your right to wardship over me until I come of legal age. As we both know, in England that is 21. But what you plainly don't know is that in Wales it is 14. And I did turn 14 in February. Hugh stared at his stepson. Llewelyn's dark eyes were shining with triumph. A smile he could not quite repress quirked one corner of his mouth. Hugh caught his breath, swore softly. Little wonder the lad had been so cocky. He'd known for the first that he was playing with the loaded dice. Hugh was swallowing bile, spat into the floor rushes. Rob was right. There was no reasoning with the Welsh. They were all mad, beyond redemption or understanding. What were they to tell Chester? The opportunity of a lifetime lost to them, all because a headstrong boy wanted to play the rebel. And what of your brother? Would you leave him without a qualm, knowing he has such need of you, knowing you go where he cannot follow? Other, he is very well. Do not speak of him as if he were not even here. There was a strange silence. Other had gone very pale, but he said, quite evenly, I want Llewelyn to go. Want him to claim that which is his. So would I, had God not willed otherwise. Hugh felt a touch of shame. It was Llewelyn he'd wanted to wound, not the innocent other. Llewelyn was staring at him, accusing, defiant. Whatever chance he might have had of prevailing was utterly gone now. Llewelyn might, he knew, forgive a slight on his own behalf, but on others, never. He'd not yield in this, knowing he had the full backing of his Welsh kinsmen. All their plans set at naught, their hopes of an alliance with Chester, now gall and wormwood, ashes in his mouth. Go to Gwynedd and be damned then, he said bitterly, and turned away. They watched in silence as Hugh strode from the hall. But when Marared rose to follow him, Llewelyn stepped in front of her. Mamma. No, Llewelyn. Do not expect my blessing. Do not expect my forgiveness either. He'd won, but he could take no pleasure in it. Not now. Llewelyn sank down on the dais steps, passed some moments disconsolately, sliding his dagger up and down his sheath. The excitement he'd experienced in sharing his plans with Nevydd and Rhys had gone suddenly sour, tarnished by his mother's tears. Arthur, Marared let her hand linger on her younger son's shoulder. Are you coming, lad? Yes, mamma. As Arthur rose, Llewelyn looked up, said, Hugh did not mean that, Arthur. He was angry. Just did not think. People never do they? Arthur smiled thinly. Yet we'd be apart too once you were sent off to serve as Chester's squire. Better you should follow your heart. Their eyes caught, pulled away. Marared was waiting. Arthur reached for his crutch, angled it under his armpit. Watching his brother limp towards the door, Llewelyn felt a protective pang. What Arthur had just said was true. It was also true that he was being left behind. Morgan, am I doing the right thing? If I said no, would you heed me? Llewelyn considered, and then gave the priest a rueful smile. No, he conceded. Gwynedd is my birthright, but it's likely to take years to claim it. Years I can ill afford to squander in Shropshire. I have to do this, Morgan. I have to. Morgan nodded slowly. He'd expected no less. He, more than anyone else, had nurtured in Llewelyn a love for his heritage, his homeland, had moulded youthful clay into adult ambition. He was proud of what he had accomplished, proud of Llewelyn's resolve, his daring. But he could not help feeling fear too, for Llewelyn was the son he'd never have. I cannot say I approve, lad. And then, very softly, but I do understand.